Hello, my name is Graham Ross. I'm a lawyer and mediator, and I specialize in resolving disputes between company shareholders and directors. I'm going to talk in this video about the vital importance when forming and running a limited company of having a shareholder agreement. In fact, I think it's reckless on the part of any company shareholders to proceed without one. Now let me go through some examples of the problems that can occur without a shareholder agreement and why an agreement will help resolve those matters. Well, what happens when one day a working shareholder says to the others, I've decided to emigrate to Australia. They wish him well and perhaps ask him, of course, quite naturally, well, will you please sign a transfer over of the shares? But he may turn around and say, no, I don't want to sell my shares. I'm going to hold on to them. This company is doing very well, and I would see that as my investment for the future. Well, of course, if you can't oblige him to transfer the shares, it means that in future, when you want to issue dividends, which of course is a very tax efficient way to distribute profit, you will have to share those dividends with him, proportionate to his shares, even though he's not contributed to the future success of the company. Now, therefore, you would have in a shareholders agreement a provision that in fact would force him to transfer his shares when he left employment. Let's also look at the situation where a working shareholder does something wrong for the company and everybody else would like to dismiss him from employment. He's committed some significant disciplinary offence. Once again, you can have a provision in the shareholder agreement that if someone is dismissed for disciplinary reasons from the company, that not only is he obliged to transfer his shares, but that he receives only a nominal £1 for his shares. Now, assuming the shareholder has not committed any offence, has not been dismissed, but has left voluntarily, whether to emigrate or not, then becomes a question of how the price is negotiated. Well, again, the shareholders' agreement ought to have provisions that if the parties can't agree a valuation between themselves, that in fact one will be reached by an independent, neutral, professional advisor with knowledge about how to value shares. Another cause of disputes in a company is over some of the intellectual property rights. So, for example, let's take a very common situation where somebody starts a business on his own. He acquires and registers a domain name and has a website built. Now, the website content, the domain name, these are intellectual property rights that ordinarily then would be owned by the person who created them, devised the name. If there is no agreement reached over the intellectual property right, then the vital domain name and the website content in law will still remain with the person who created it. So these problems are best overcome with provision in a shareholder agreement to make it absolutely clear that everybody agrees that the intellectual property rights are to be with the limited company itself. Let's also look at the situation where the majority of shareholders have found a buyer for the company and want to sell. Now, most buyers will want 100% of the company, but what happens if a minority shareholder decides he doesn't want to sell? So again, in shareholders' agreements, this is anticipated with what's called a drag-along clause that would force a minority shareholder to sell at the same price as the majority. But a similar situation is where perhaps unusually, but it does happen, a buyer is quite happy to just buy the majority and doesn't want to pay for the minority shares, even though the minority shareholder does want to sell. So again, you would have a clause called a tag-along clause that in fact requires the majority who is selling to not sell until they've obtained the agreement of the buyer to buy the minority shareholders' shares at the same rate. Reverting back to the situation where working shareholders leave the company, If they haven't got a formal employment contract, which is often the case with shareholder employees, then there's nothing, once they've left the company, to stop them competing with the company. So you'd have in the shareholders agreement post departure restrictions on that shareholder once he's sold his shares and left the company to not compete for, say, a year or two. And you could also include provisions to, for example, not poach staff of the company for a certain period of time or deal with customers or suppliers of the company. You might also have provisions that add higher voting levels for certain resolutions and agreements that the company might make in shareholder. But it may make sense for some of the more important decisions, say spending over certain levels, investing in other companies, changing the nature of the business, removing a director or even voting directors on, that perhaps that should have more than just the 51% support. But sometimes you may make a provision that's not actually based on the percentages. Take, for example, a situation where two shareholders have a personal relationship outside of the company, maybe husband and wife. They may together have more than 50% of the shares, but it may be felt appropriate to have a provision that the people in voting for any particular class of important and significant resolution should comprise of, say, at least 3 shareholders, whatever their voting percentages are. Importantly, you would have provisions to help resolve disputes, particularly stalemate situations. And also, of course, you'd need more generally dispute resolution provisions, again, setting out processes where there is no actual stalemate, but just disharmony, disagreement, processes to follow to help resolve these matters quickly, privately and internally, without perhaps people having to go elsewhere, particularly to the courts. There are so many other provisions you could have in a shareholder agreement, because really there is no limit to what you can have on them, and the more provisions you put in agreeing what to do in certain situations that could otherwise cause problems, the less problems and disagreements do we reach. Of course, when there are disputes between shareholders, it doesn't really matter who's in the right or who's in the wrong, because everybody suffers, because the company inevitably suffer if you're not all pulling in the right direction. So therefore, it is absolutely vital to have a shareholders agreement. Thank you very much for watching this video, and please get in touch with me if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss any of this with me. Thank you.